Today we will discuss one of the important functions of management, the first function of management, planning. In this lecture we will try to cover definition, types, the steps involved in planning, also the various processes, and also what do we mean by strategy or strategies along with the planning. The basic learning objectives are, for this session, at the end of the session you would be able to define what planning is all about. You also know the types of planning, you also know the steps involved in managerial planning activities, and you also know what strategies are and how different organizations go about strategy formulation. So, the first step is to look at what this planning is all about. Planning has been defined variously, different people have viewed it, as we have seen in the last lecture, like with respect to the top management, with respect to the middle management, with respect to the lower aspect of the management. But basically planning is the first function to be performed. Without planning you cannot think of organizing, you can't think of coordination, you cannot think of control. So, that is how planning has been considered as primary function of the management. It governs the survival, growth and prosperity of any organization, and that too in a changing competitive kind of a situation. The planning becomes much more important and critical. So, as you see, the planning becomes a fundamental controlling aspect. So, you will also, when we talk of controlling, we always refer back to the planning. We refer back to the standards what the organization has set, and with respect to that we would do the control functions. Similarly, when we look at leading or coordination, we refer back to the planning what the organization has done, and with respect to the plan we would do the coordination, we would do the controlling. So, it is in that sense it is a fundamental. So, a plan is nothing but, in a very simplest way, a predetermined course of action to achieve the specific goals or aim. So, the aim, goals, vision, mission, these are all the key words when we look at planning as a fundamental activity. Planning is also an intellectual process. This is what many have defined, which requires a manager to think before acting. So, that means you are going to look at the future, you are going to generate alternatives, you are going to evaluate the best course of action, and then also decide different steps to achieve those goals and get the required agreement or commitment of those people who are going to implement those plans, and you do all that before even you start off or you start implementing. So, it is in that sense the planning is also seen as an intellectual activity. So, the planning, if you see, one can look at as a strategic planning. The strategic planning basically comes from the view that organization takes position long term view of what needs to be achieved. So, the long term and top management driven gives that view of what is known as a strategic planning. Similarly, when you look at short term, where you do quarterly or half yearly, where the time zone is much more shorter compared to the long term, it is also used as a tactical planning. And when you also see the future positions, like a company would like to be the number one in that particular industry in terms of the market share, or it would be the number one to attract the best talent in the industry. These are all kind of like a purpose or like a mission planning. So, over a period of time organizations would like to achieve that kind of a position. So, that is how we see, when we see the types of planning can be classified based on the purpose, the strategic view of the system, or it could be the tactical or this like funds management, the sales targets to be achieved. These are much more short term, much more in terms of a 6 months to a yearly or sometimes some of the organizations also see it in terms of the quarterly thing. And the strategic is the long term, much more driven by the top management. So, let us get into the details of the strategic planning. The strategic planning, it involves deciding what the major goals of the entire organization will be and what policies will guide the organization in pursuing these goals. I think when I talk about the strategic planning, people also refer to as the business model. What is the business model of the organization? Let us simplify this topic. Let me give you an example. Let us say that I will give you a basket of orange and I want you to go sell and come back. So, when you have that, what is that you will see? So, you have a basket of oranges and then you have to make some decisions. Some decision is what shall I sell the whole basket in one go, or should I go and sell one by one. So, this is one kind of a view. Then you would like to go to the marketplace and see what is happening there. So, you go to the marketplace, there are already about 20 people are selling the oranges. So, then you have to decide whether you will be the first person in that or amongst those 20 people, or you have to be in the middle of those 20 people, or you would be at the end of those 20 people. After that, you also have to decide whether you would like to be away from all those 20 people and stand pretty opposite, and then at the end or at the beginning. So, you have to make some of these decisions. Apart from that, then you have to see what is going to be your pricing. So, should I price exactly what they are selling, or should I price little less than what they are selling, or should I price little more or much more than what they are selling. Further, business models comes into picture, where you have to go one step beyond then whether you should sell the oranges based on its quality or its price, or you can also see sometimes people sell the basket instead of the orange. So, you plan to sell the basket, but less of the orange, sometimes little more. If you are very charismatic or a charismatic person, you will sell the oranges based on your smile, and then both the basket and the oranges becomes less important. So, when we see the strategic planning means that you position yourself into the overall market and to the kind of a product what you have, and an analysis of both your internal and that external strength. I think the strategic planning is nothing but positioning yourself and also achieving your goals based on well articulated, well reasoned out, well understood steps. So, the planning becomes a clear process of establishing various steps and also understanding the means and methods to achieve those steps. Let us also look at little bit about the tactical planning. The tactical planning, it involves deciding specifically how the resources of the organization will be used to help the organization achieve its strategic goals. So, that means, so you have your strategic goals in the mind, but then you have to deal with specific conditions which will come into picture. It is like one of the persons who wanted to establish a big poultry business mentioned to me that he had to use the money not only to bring the resources on the day one, but he also had to sort out the rule making machinery. He had to get the licenses, he had to get the permission, he had to get the required permissions from the inspectorate of the drug inspectorate in particular. So, the point is that if the resources, suddenly you will find that whatever the thing you wanted to buy on raw materials also must be used for few other things, and that time you need to make necessary adjustments, both very on a daily basis, on a short term basis, but sometimes on quarterly, half yearly and yearly basis what I said. These are called the tactical planning. The tactical planning are the kind of pressures which can come because of uncertainties which you are not able to understood or forecast, and as you are into that situation you will see the pressures of the situation and then you make necessary adjustments. It could be power fluctuations for a company, or it could be a short supply of raw materials, or it could be the work stoppages and slowdown or negative things which can come with respect to the labor or the human resource, which could be very temporary in its nature or it could be semi-permanent in its nature. So, one need to address these things, but these are part of achieving this long term goals of the organization. So, when you address some of these short term difficulties, short term challenges, or the challenges which you get across as you are passing through from one stage to the other, these are basically referred to as the tactical planning. Tactical planning and the long term planning have to go hand in hand. So, sometimes we can also see what is known as a purpose or mission planning. Many times we do not even know some of the steps, but you want to be better than the best in the industry. So, that is all is this kind of a single statement the organization can make, and you also want to be the best, you want to be the number one in the industry with respect to maybe market share or with respect to the person who is introducing maximum number of new products, or it is possible to set yourself that you would be attracting best of the talent from some of the premier institutes in the country. So, it could be the kind of a goal where you want to be treated as the most preferred employer. So, as you set this kind of a mission, then you also start what we call it as doing a kind of a benchmarking. So, that means you set the goals in relation to the other, and benchmarking becomes an aid in planning, or benchmarking also helps you to judge how far you have achieved the set goals and also how far you are achieving the stated plans. So, the plans becomes a kind of an articulated, clearly laid out steps and the processes to meet those set goals. Let us look at when you look at the types of planning. So, every function has to be related and then it has to be linked, and sometimes this planning comes because of the imposed goals of the society. So, the planning cannot be wished away without meeting the social responsibility. Sometimes also we call this affirmative action, which can come and put some stakes on the organizational goals. So, let us go a little more further and let us analyze the steps in managerial planning. When we look at the managerial planning, what is that we should do? The first important thing comes the awareness of opportunities and problems. The people also try and give this view that you need to analyze these opportunities, problems and threat internally as well as externally. So, the internal means you are understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, in the sense organizational strengths and weaknesses, and externally we are looking at the opportunities and the threats. It is also called as SWOT or the SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis represents S for strengths, W for weaknesses, O for opportunities and T for threats. So, when the organization gets into the details, it starts analyzing what are our core strengths, what is that we are extremely good at. Do we have the talent? Do we have the intellectual property? Do we have the product? Can we do things with a speed which others cannot do it, or do we have a know-how which is so unique? So, the many of these things are essentially become strengths. Some organizations good at distribution, some have some customer loyalty, some have patronage of some of the big organization where we can do what is known as piggybacking. So, the question comes is what kind of strengths do you bring to the table, not as at individual level, but at the organizational level. Size becomes an opportunity for some time, a strength. Some other time it becomes a kind of a liability or becomes a weaknesses. So, that means you also see from the strengths you move on to the weaknesses. So, what are the weaknesses of the organization could be? That you do not have the required talent at different levels, because you could be a very young organization, or it could be a very aging organization, or you are in a technology domain where you do not understand the complete picture of the technology. So, all these situations will help you to look at what are the weaknesses of the organization. Sometimes you have a great idea, but you do not have resources to protect your ideas, or there is not much of a money, or you do not have a resources to deal with the competition. So, the weaknesses could be many. It could be, it could vary from individual to technology to the processes to some of the brand equity kind of a thing. The brand equity is the goodwill what you have in the marketplace and what is that you are known for. So, all these things if you see, one need to go through in detail the strengths and the weaknesses. Now, the question comes, when you are getting into the planning mode, should you do this individually, that is one person in the organization, or should you do it collectively, that is at different levels or all levels put together? Should you do it with the help of an external expert, or should you leave it to an external agency completely? I think these questions need to be understood when we are looking at the analysis of strengths and weaknesses. It is desirable that it is top driven, but there is participation at all levels, because the participation helps in collecting all the necessary information, in understanding the different context and meaning of the strengths and weaknesses, and also pooling the ideas together, particularly when you have to generate the required alternatives to achieve the set goals. So, the strengths and weaknesses, we also looked at the other two words is called the opportunities and the threats. Opportunities is that what others are doing in the marketplace. So, that gives you a kind of a gap. So, you may know that people take lot of time, and so can you address the time factor, so that you give what is known as the time advantage to the people. So, people pay money for you because you save your time. So, the opportunities means you will analyze the market requirements. It can be seen in terms of what the customer wants. So, the customer requirements you can look at and prioritize those requirements, or you can also analyze what others are doing in the marketplace and then see what they are not capable of doing or delivering, and then you need to be positioning yourself. So, when you see this positioning and understanding these opportunities, people try and use these words, what is known as a differentiation and integration. So, in the marketplace you need to be different from the others. So, you need to see what is that you will do something different, something more compared to the others. It is also called as the value addition. What is the value proposition? What is the difference you are going to make to the others? So, once you are able to understand the difference, once you are able to understand the value proposition, to that extent your planning could be much more useful and very purposeful. Similarly, the integration is that you should also know what strengths are available in the marketplace. I used that word earlier, like piggybacking. So, you can also combine some of the strengths available of the bigger player, and then if you are going along with that person, then it is positioning and the planning could be much more useful. Let us look at one example. Most of the time you are seeing that the petrol bunks, Along with the petrol bunks, you also see some of the convenience stores. So, these convenience stores, the retailing person would use it as a kind of a strategy to be there and then making available when people have little time and they can also buy these things. So, the question is that you are seeing a kind of an opportunity in the marketplace, how you can make use of that opportunity. Then comes the threats. The threats could be both short term as well as long term. The threats can come because of the kind of technology and the R&D strengths what you have, particularly the markets where innovations are very common, where people are coming with new products and new services, and that is the time where the threat is how long you can sustain your business, how long you can sustain your business with the same set of products and services. In a fast changing consumer driven markets, always people find that threats are much more for the organization, because the styles can change, preferences can change, needs can change. Certain markets where the innovations are happening, what I mentioned earlier, that people will bring new products and suddenly you will find that your products are no longer wanted in the marketplace. The threats can also come not only because of the consumer and also because of the other customers, also because of the innovation. It can also come because of the government and government policies. The threats can come because the government policies may change, it may not favor anymore small and medium sector, or sometimes if there are entry barriers are there, the government may remove some of those entry barriers. Government can also create some uncertainties with respect to the taxes. So, higher tax regime can also become a kind of a threat to the organization. So, the threats can come because the government, because of the technology in terms of the innovation, and because also that what others are doing. Also look at sometimes it can also come from internally from people. So, the threats could be where you have an internally the internal union which is not necessarily supporting all the organizational initiatives. So, the threats could be internal as well as external. So, good managers try to make an assessment of all these four, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threat, but one can also see what is that you can control, what is that you cannot control. So, that means what is that you can influence and what is that you cannot influence. So, you can see some threats which may come, but you have no mechanisms of influencing. You have to take it as a kind of a factor in your planning. But sometimes you can also see, yes, you can do something about it. That means you can do lobbying if it is a government policy. If it is a competitor, means you can do some competitive intelligence and understand what exactly is happening. So, it is certain things you can do, but sometimes you also see that I have no control. So, it is a question of controllable versus the uncontrollable factors. And you can also classify whether it is internal to the organization or it is external to the organization. So, this internal, external, the controllability also would bring, will take us to an important view that do you know in terms of certainty versus the uncertainty. The uncertain means you have no knowledge of the cause and effect relationship. The certain means the cause effect relationship is known to you. So, when we put these factors and then try and see whether I can create a marketplace for my product. So, then I will see whether it is going to be a push or a pull strategy. That means the moment I go with it, I know very clearly that I have identified the gaps in the market and people would be looking and seeking for these things. So, then it is fine, you do not have to push really. But if it is such a new product where people are not seen, people have not used and they have no understanding of this, sometimes initially the push strategy may be required. So that means a good understanding of the marketplace, good understanding of the technology, good understanding of the customer in terms of all the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, controllable, uncontrollable, internal and external, all these dimensions will help you to see what best can be done. So now see, this is what we are talking about in terms of the awareness. And once you have this awareness of all these things, then you move on to the second important thing, that is collecting and analyzing the information. So both collection and the analysis means we are trying to look at different methods of collection, that is you collect this information internally, like a big shopping mall can collect very number of transactions, number of things what happens on a daily basis, but then they can start posing some questions. They are posing questions on the data. So when they can ask the questions like, what are the chances if somebody buys a shirt would also buy a tie? What are the chances if somebody buys a tie also would buy a lipstick? So once they understand this, so that is what we are talking about information. So you have a lot of transaction, the transactions are basically considered as data, but then for the data you put a question and a query, and that we treat it as a piece of information. So once you have that information, then you start seeing the kind of a pattern. What is it, what are the probability or what are the chances, what is it now and what is it into the future, and that is how people talk and use these forecasting techniques. Will these things will continue? So then you also have to build models. The building models would depend upon what are these buying behaviors and how these buying behaviors are influenced, both like for example disposable income of the family, the economic state of the family, the social state of the family. So the socio-economic conditions, and it also depends upon whether the children are responsible for this buying or whether it is the mothers are causing this buying behavior. So what is it like? So that one need to segregate some of these things and process this information for both current as well as futuristic decisions. Like one of the machine building company person was telling me that it is the growth of automotive sectors will contribute for the growth of machine building. So one need to also look at the macroeconomic factors and the macroeconomic changes which will have implications to the organization. So collecting and analyzing this information both for short term and the long term is extremely critical for an effective planning process. And then based on all this, one need to come to the objectives, what the organization would like to do, what is that organization would like to achieve. We will go along and examine some of these details, and also the determining the planning premises and the constraints. The planning premises and the constraints can come in a smaller setup, basically by the founders and the entrepreneur, or it could be in a professionally run organization, in the sense where the owners and the managers are different. The managers determine the planning premises and the constraints, in the sense how much resources are available, what is the time period we can understand, and how these resources to be utilized. And many times the finding the alternative course of action becomes extremely important. That means lot of brainstorming is required once you have the information and once you have done the analysis. That means you have to build some scenarios. Scenarios means if we do, what is likely to happen. So this if and then would call this as basically you are trying to build scenario. So what it takes, if there are a few more people will come into the picture, what happens if my customers start changing their preferences. What is that if you are depending only on one major customer? Is it good or it is bad? So that means you are always thinking at different levels the alternate courses of action. It could be with respect to the customer preferences, as we mentioned, it could be about the technology, or it could be about the rules and regulations of the government. So many of these things need to be seen if and then kind of a context. So what people call it as the scenario building, which also is an aid for effective planning. I mentioned earlier the benchmarking, the models, the scenario building, these are all aids for good planning. We will also see the evaluation of alternative and selection of an appropriate method or the appropriate course of action. People also call it as road mapping. So the road mapping one can do only for technology, only for the growth of the business. So one can see whether you would do a step by step approaches, or whether you will do a vertical and backward kind of an integration, or you would go in a kind of a spiral kind of a growth. So when you see growth itself as an objective, but then you have to look at the alternatives available to you. So if you see for example the Gillette. So the Gillette is what? Gillette is a shaving products company. So when you see they go in a step by step process means, so initially they introduce a particular men's product in one to the market, and then they stabilize. So there is a stabilization period, and then they will go for the next, they will introduce one more variant from a twin blade to maybe 3 blade kind of a thing, and then again they will stabilize and see, and then they will introduce a woman product, and then they will stabilize, and then they introduce maybe some shaving thing apart from the blade, some shaving brush or the shaving cream. So what you are seeing is the growth being an objective, then you will define the step by step, a kind of a staircase approach. Or one can also take a spiral kind of a mode where you are continuously increasing your market presence and acquiring more and more customers, more and more institutional customers, or more and more individual customers. So you see how your spiral growth can come. Sometimes people also call this growth as organic growth or inorganic growth. So the organic growth is achieved either by this staircase approach or the kind of a spiral approach, but inorganic growth can come what people refer to as mergers and acquisition. So you take over a company which is similar to your product line. So you do not want any competitors to be coming into the future, or you want to deal with competition very effectively. So you try and make a bid and buy of these companies. So the mergers is one kind of a thing. Sometimes you also look at the way you get going with others. So big giants sometimes combine and merge themselves and then see new opportunities for themselves. So the mergers and acquisitions are another kind of, where we call it as an inorganic kind of a method to achieve these growth objectives. So as you are seeing that even though it is the growth as the desirable position of the organization, then there are many alternative methods. It could be organic or it could be inorganic, it could be staircase or it could be spiral. It can also be vertical and, or what people call as the vertical or the backward or the forward integration. So that is a time where you try and focus on your supply side, or you try and see the end customer, so and then try and build. So it is like if you look at the GE as an example, if you see, this is just started as a bulb manufacturing company, but from bulbs they thought it is important to have electricity to use the bulbs. Then it is, in order to have electricity you have to have a power generation. power generation to power distribution. So, power generation, power distribution, then it requires a lot of money. So, then you also get into the financing and then banking and GE capital kind of a thing. Then you, since you know about your turbines, then why not you manufacture aircrafts. So, then you get into the engines, engine manufacturing. So, you can see from one to the other, the organization builds its strength and also builds its presence, which you can see as vertical and horizontal, or the backward and the forward kind of an integration. So, that is the, when you look at alternatives, there could be many of these alternatives available for every manager and every organization, and one of the fundamental things is to understand these alternatives and then evaluate these alternatives with respect to the strengths, weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats, and positioning the organization towards those end goals. Then you also have to see what happens. We talked about the scenario planning. So, determining some of the secondary plans. If not, if you are able to do something, what is that we can do as the next best alternative. So, you are trying to deal with uncertainties. The secondary plans becomes extremely important, where the rate of change in the environment becomes an important or a dominant pattern. Similarly, whether your environment is homogeneous or heterogeneous, homogeneous with respect to the customer, homogeneous to the in terms of the demands of your products and the services. Heterogeneous, we are talking about many customers or many suppliers kind of thing. So, in a homogeneous environment where you have a single supplier, heterogeneous means you have a multiple supplier, or you have a single customer to which you supply everything. So, that's how the growth of that single customer, the performance of that single customer becomes very, very critical to you. Similarly, when you have a many, means you are talking about heterogeneous kind of a situation. So, you have a heterogeneous customer situations. To that extent, you know, your risk is less, complexity is less, uncertainty is less. So, the question comes, should you have a loyal single kind of a buyer from you. So, that is, you know, where the complete assurance is there, but it also comes what happens if the person or if that organization, if that one single customer gets affected because of some other market conditions. So, these ancillaries, when they are planning, usually they get into this situation. Much more than what happens to them, they need to understand what happens to their the customer to whom they are all building the products and services. So, it is in that sense when we have to see the secondary plans are totally dependent upon the rate of change in the organizational elements, which can also be characterized in terms of the homogeneous versus the heterogeneity, and together they define whether the environment is very static or dynamic. Static where things are not changing, and dynamic means things are changing very rapidly. So, very clearly you get 4 positions. So, you can have very static, homogeneous kind of an environment situation with respect to your supplier, it could be your financiers, it could be about the customers, and it could be at some other time you will see it is heterogeneous but still static. So, the static homogeneous or static heterogeneous. So, the static heterogeneous, there are several people, several suppliers or several customers, but things are not changing, that is time rate of change is slow or time rate of change is very fast. So, you have a dynamic situations. So, get these 4 things, homogeneous versus heterogeneous, both it could be static and another it is the dynamic, homogeneous or heterogeneous. Dynamic homogeneous means you have a single customer, but the requirements are changing fast, fast changing in terms of the technology deployment kind of a thing. But in a heterogeneous, and also it is the dynamic, means it is extremely complex, because several things are changing and changes are coming with respect to too many dimensions. So, it is in that sense the secondary plans are basically suggested for those organizations which are addressing heterogeneous and the fast changing situations, particularly what we call the dynamic situations. Once you have all these scenarios, understanding, analysis, benchmarking, the models, the cause effect relationship, an assessment of both internal, external strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats, and a clear perception of what is that you can control, what is that you cannot control. I think that is the time where you should also make sure that the employees are understanding, participating in this process. So, when you see the securing participation of employees, three levels of things are extremely important. One, their awareness. Unless they have a clear understanding, appreciation, so that is one kind of an exercise good planners need to do. The second part is the acceptance. Many times if they are not participating in generating the alternatives, if they are not doing the brainstorming, so I mentioned many of the aids to the planning. I mentioned to you models, mentioned to you the benchmarking. So, brainstorming is another aid to the, is one of the aids to a good planning exercise. Particularly employees need to do this brainstorming. Brainstorming is also considered as one of the basic tools of creativity. They are able to see the data, they are able to have the required understanding and the perception, and able to look at the details in different fashions and then arrive at a course of action. All these are participation. So, this participation process would always help in getting the commitment of the employees, commitment of the managers at different levels to do effective implementation. So, the implementation aspect can come through this, the first two processes, awareness and acceptance. So, what we are talking really is awareness, acceptance and commitment. So, participation is an important element to achieve these three things. Also look at the providing for follow up and future evaluation. Any amount of planning one may do because of the nature of industry, because of the products and the services what the organization is providing, the size and complexity internal as well as external to that organization makes it necessary to plan a step by step process of looking at various steps of the set goals and also making sure whether you have achieved those goals or not, or whether you are in the right direction to achieve those goals or not. One cannot have a surprise only at the end. So, it is in that direction one need to see the steps, also need to provide for good follow up, good review processes to understand the direction in which you are proceeding and making assessments. It is also called as providing for some gates. Gates and measures or providing different levels of reviewing is an important step one should do and one should achieve at the planning level itself. Let us also look at the how one would go about in terms of the awareness of these opportunities and problems. As I mentioned, one need to see the unexploited business opportunities or the problems what the marketplace provides for the organization to address a kind of a future requirements. So, one can go on asking some of these questions. Unless you ask questions, unless you understand the problems, unless you formulate a problem, good planning cannot be done. So, according to many, so one need to see what business opportunities or problems are likely to arise in the future, these two questions. what is the plan to be formulated to exploit such opportunities. Problems are two generic questions, but one need to ask these questions in different ways to see the future positions. We have also talked about the collecting and analyzing the information. As you are posing the problem, start putting the pieces of information together. That is how the databases becomes very important. Organization tries to look at the past trends and also into the future, the past trends to the forecasting, the different methods of forecasting becomes relevant, and the data interpretation and the looking at the objectives. So, as you are getting into the objectives, we see very clearly it need to be very specific and it need to be clear. The specific means we are now creating ourselves into what position we would like to be in. It would be that is at number 3, number 1, number 5, number 10. So, the organizations based on the assessment would see what is the likely probability we will move into in terms of the market position, or in terms of number of new products we are able to bring together, or you are able to do this kind of a cost cutting or add to the profits. So, the profits, cost, positioning, the growth, these are all could be the different kinds of objectives what one organization can think of setting, but it needs to be specific and very clear. The clear objectives help getting the alignment at all levels, alignments of the people to work towards that. So, the organizations would set, for example, in a hotel industry, the room occupancy rates as one of the very clear and very specific measurable objectives. Now, that becomes very easy. Organization tries to achieve for 100% room occupancy. So, similarly, the capacity utilization could be a useful thing for a manufacturing organization. So, how can we reach that kind of a maximum capacity? So, what it takes to do the material planning, what it takes to do the human resource planning, what it takes to do the facility planning. So, all these things are derived based on those specific objectives. So, they should indicate the end result of this planning activity. Planning becomes perfect, planning becomes more effective, planning becomes smooth if the objectives are specific and if the objectives are clear. But when you ask whether the planning first or the objectives are first, but it need to be seen together. Sometimes the planning will lead to the kind of setting of the objectives, but then objectives get refined around that planning constraints. However, to overcome this kind of a conflict, the best is to have the vision of the organization and based on that very clearly set the objectives, and then once the objectives are set, you do all the required planning. And then during the planning, you will also understand some of the conflicting goals, conflicting things where you can't do much, and that is the time where you also work on the objectives and set which realistic, specific and clear objectives. I think that is where you need to see the role of the objectives or the goal setting. So, when you see the goal setting or the objectives, it should be set for the organization as a whole. When you do the planning, it should be done first organization as a whole, and then it should be broken down at the divisional level or at the departmental level or at different groups level. So, the departmental or sectional objectives should come later. What is important is to find and finished objectives at the organizational level. However, some organizations think what is known as a top down approaches and the bottom up approaches to the planning. The top down approaches is the goals and the objectives are set based on the analysis, based on the forecasting, based on the methods and tools what I mentioned earlier, and then it is broken down at different levels so that you get into the divisionalized plans, departmental plans, or for different functions the plans are worked out. There is opposite is also true. There are many organizations strongly believe that you need to do the planning what called the bottom up approach. So, when particularly the market informations are extremely sensitive and influencing, they would like to start from the bottom up approach. So, each of the level would indicate what are the possibilities, what are the goals that can be achieved, and then you start aggregating at different levels. So, you start the planning exercise at the lowest level in the organization, and then the aggregation is achieved at different levels, and then finally the organizational plans are aggregated and finalized at the highest level. The bottom up approaches are fine where the nature of organizational environment is much more static and the conditions are not much changing, and the divisions, the departments have much more local information, and they also know the methods and means to achieve the required positions of the organization at the local level. And that is the time where the bottom up approaches are much more useful, much more effective. However, there is no one single method, either the top down or the bottom up approach to the planning can be stated as the best method. One need to look at the technology, one look at the products, one need to look at the services, and also one need to see at what level the critical information is available to the organization, and what level the perfect assessment of the situations can be made, and that would lead to the approach of bottom up or the top down approaches. It may be necessary to bring these two approaches together and organization gets into a better planning process. So, the assumptions and the approaches, they go together. The premises and the constraints also go together. So, when you see the forecast of conditions like trends in population, political and economic environment, production cost, advertising policy, availability of labor, material, power, etc. So, each of these things would provide some kind of an understanding, some kind it can pose as a constraint, it can also pose as a facilitating factor. So, the planning depends on a assessment of these available things. As we talked about earlier, the government control can definitely be a kind of a constraint, or sometimes it is also becomes a useful thing, like public sectors enjoyed what people call as the monopoly. License Raj conditions in this country allow for a kind of a monopoly. So, the control helped some organizations, help certain organizations to retain its position, also grow. Sometimes when these controls were liberalized, some of the organizations also complained about the level playing fields. So, the same controls which they enjoyed, they felt it is now adversely affecting their own competitiveness. So, it is in that sense one need to see the plans and the formulation of the policies of how the organization would view these things, both in the short term and the long term, and also the kind of constraints which would pose. I have mentioned this, the finding out this alternate course of action, the working out the details, but the number of alternatives and making sure that all possible alternatives to work out a plan are considered, and then the best course of action what is also achieved. It is extremely clear to look at what is best for the organization. What is best for the organization need to be understood both in terms of the short term and the long term. Sometimes the organizations which are driven by innovation would like to take little risk because they want to understand the know-how, what is happening in the marketplace, what is happening with respect to the technology. So, in the short term it should be seen as developing capabilities, capacities, even though end results could be that they are not achieving the growth or even they may be making losses. But if you see over a period of years, then the learning whatever they have done can also contribute, and the kind of strengths what they have built by being present in the marketplace can also be contributing for the strengths. So, the course of action need to be looked into both short term as well as in terms of the long term. However, some of these things are becoming extremely important. The cost, speed, quality would define very clearly what is the course of action. Whatever it adds to the minimizing the cost, whatever it adds to the speed to the market and through which we can deliver the goods and services, and whatever it adds to the quality, one can see how to build these things, and course of action need to identify what is that will add to all the three things. Secondary plans, as we have mentioned, is the formulating to support the basic plan. It should not be in lieu of or in conflict with the basic plans. And the secondary plan, again, it should be organization wide and it should not be at a divisional level. And participation of the employees, the successful execution of the plan depends to a large extent on the wholehearted cooperation of the employees in planning through communication, consultation and participation. So, the providing for follow up and future evaluation, it must ensure that you are on the right lines, you are in the particularly the direction is very important, and the continuous is another key word, continuous evaluation and appraisal of the plan. So, the management can understand the shortcomings, could be because of the attitudes of the people, it could be because of the technology, it could be the kind of processes which has been strengthened or not. So, it is in that sense the organizations can look at the follow up and the review as extremely critical. Strategy, I would like to spend little time, is a term which we have used earlier. Particularly it is used in the battlefields to plan a military movement and handling of troops. As you see, it usually includes the formulation of a goal and set of action plans to accomplish that goal. So, the basic difference between the plan and the strategy is that it is much more vision driven, top driven and indicates a future position. The plans are much more short term based on the detailed analysis of the constraints and the opportunities and the steps to follow and achieve those set objectives. So, the strategy indicates a specific program of action for achieving the organizational objectives. It can be a value proposition, it could be derived from the vision and the views of the entrepreneur or the owner, or sometimes it is driven by some of the leaders of the organization. But the strategy is organizational objectives. If you see, then the strategies could be in terms of the using resources efficiently, and also the concept itself is not new, but many have used this. It is a Greek term which means the art or science of being a general. So, effective Greek generals needed to lead an army, win and hold territory, protect cities from invasion, destroy the enemy, etc. So, these are all the terms where we are using the strategy, but the strategy is that each of these objectives can be achieved in certain fashion. So, the specific ways of achieving this, and that is how the effective generals had to determine the right lines of supply, decide when to fight, when not to, when to withdraw, when to be present. and therefore the planning and action together define what the strategies are. The strategy had both the planning component and an action component, and it is no different even today. So with all this, now we have discussed about the planning, and we will move on to the next topic of how to achieve the objectives, and we will spend little time on management by objectives.